Folks, welcome back to a special edition of the Texas SignalCast. I'm your host, Joe Desotel, and I'm here with my co-host, David Leffler. Hey, David.
What's going on, Joe? How are you today?
I'm doing pretty good, except for about 666 reasons to not feel so great. That's the number of bills that go into effect on September 1st. And thanks to the Texas legislature this session. So I appreciate having you on so we can kind of talk through some of the bigger bills that passed. Unfortunately, not a lot of great stuff here. I mean, most of it is pretty bad. On the top of things, I mean, everything from abortion to guns to critical race theory, some COVID stuff, vaccine passports. I mean, it's just like a grab bag of right-wing propaganda and news sites, whatever you'd see on Breitbart. It's pretty much, you'll find it in this list.
Right. It's almost as if the 666 in terms of the number of bills in there is a symbolic thing when it comes to just what is in this these number of bills, right? And I think I can put it plainly that it's pretty much a shit sandwich of legislation when it comes of what is being given to Texans and what's going into effect on September 1st, which is the day we're recording this. We're going to go through just a few of the most notable pieces of legislation and looking at how they're going to affect Texans, just not only today and not just around the state, but moving forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think, let's start at the top here with SB 8, which is basically the 6-week ban on abortion. And, what you're hearing a lot of activists, and I talked to people at the party today, and I'm seeing these PACs and progressive organizations talk about this, and people are very concerned about this. Essentially, this is the first sort of weeks that women would even know or even have the ability to know that they're pregnant. And so that's what's, part of the egregiousness of this is. And then there are folks out there that are trying to come up with ways to mitigate this. I know, advocates have been asking for the Supreme Court to do something. And it seemed like today was a critical deadline because they basically ignored or did not respond to that request. I think it was the ACLU that I saw talking about that. What have you learned about that and some of the other efforts that folks are making to mitigate this?
Right. And I think, just to kind of rewind and look at the many facets of this bill, we really have to reemphasize those things just for people to understand just really how kind of egregious it is. As Joe, as you mentioned, it bans all abortions after 6 weeks. That's a time frame that, according to Whole Women's Health, which is a major provider in the state of Texas, that would eliminate up to 90% of the surgeries in the state, which is obviously an intentional thing. Many women don't know that they're pregnant at 6 weeks. The bill does not allow for exemptions for victims of rape or incest. And what really distinguishes this bill from previous attempts in Texas and elsewhere is that, to avoid running into any kind of violation of Roe v. Wade, the state's not trying to enforce this. It instead basically set it up to where private citizens can help enforce it on their behalf, right? It empowers anyone who opposes the medical procedure to file a lawsuit against anyone who's involved with a potential abortion that were to take place at or after 6 weeks. And that could be the husband of someone who helped orchestrate, basically took them to a clinic. It could be the provider themselves. It could be an Uber driver. And so basically what it does is it deputizes private citizens, and it doesn't just deputize them, but it incentivizes, right? If anyone can sue, you don't have to even live in the state of Texas to sue. You don't have to be impacted by the surgery in whatever way. You can just basically find wind of someone who might have had an abortion and try to sue them. And it incentivizes it in the sense that should you win the civil suit, you'll be awarded $10,000. So it's literally a bounty on this. And meanwhile, if you are someone who's sued and accused of violating this law, even if you win, you're not reimbursed for the legal fees and the time that you've had to allocate. So it just really it's an intentionally creative and maniacal way to get around, what little abortion protections women in Texas have
Yeah.
had up to this point.
Yeah, I mean it's cruel and unusual. I mean, I think that that's sort of the intent of the bill, right? Is to endear as much shaming and as they can to women who have to go through an already difficult situation. So that's their goal. That's always been their goal. It's unfortunate, but as you said, they've over the years have had to come up with more and more creative ways to ban or limit abortion access because it's always sort of the topic du jour, no matter what is going on else in the session. That's always something where they keep it on the table so they can just go further and further and further. And then, every now and then a court will knock them back a few steps and then just come back the next time with something more, as you say, creative and maniacal. So here we are.
Yeah, and there was there was a point in time where a lot of advocates and these healthcare agencies, they had been expecting and hoping for an injunction on this, and but then kind of unexpectedly, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals for the U.S. judiciary, excuse me, decided to cancel a hearing on it on Monday and basically just kind of cleared it to go into effect on Wednesday, September 1st. So I mean, it's harrowing when you read some of the things that folks are going through, right? There was an article
Mm-hmm.
in the 19th where it described uh, a clinic in Fort Worth where they essentially were, up against the clock trying to perform as many of these procedures as possible the night before midnight because they knew just, basically that time was running out. There was stories of full waiting rooms of women who were desperate to be able to receive the care that they're entitled to, including one woman who, according to the story, which I would suggest anyone go read, it's in the 19th. It talks about one woman who was set to go to prison for 5 years in a couple of weeks, and she was just like, I don't want to have this baby in jail. This is not something that I want to go through or put my child through. And, she was on the floor on her knees begging. So that's just something we should all be aware of. And that, there are, organizations out there that are trying to raise money to not only fight this in court, but also to help people who, in the future, if this is going to stand, to be able to provide transportation for folks who can get out of the state and receive these services elsewhere. Because at the end of the day, right, no surprise, these bills affect, low-income communities and communities of color the most.
Yeah, and you did mention that the city of Austin was doing something as well.
Right. The city of Austin has said that they're going to allocate $500,000 of their city budget to help provide means of transportation for women who need to access these services elsewhere in different states. And they're encouraging other cities to do so. So very early on, but hopefully we'll see more developments of that kind looking ahead.
Yeah. So let's talk about some things that you can do now. And one is carry a gun anywhere, anytime, no permit, no nothing, no questions asked, hidden, not hidden, doesn't matter. No license, no training. Just, as they say, the Second Amendment is now your permit. So according to these folks.
Yeah, we're in the Wild West, right?
Yeah.
I think the thing that always dawns on me when we get to this time of the year is that you have this initial outrage when a lot of these bills passed in session, and then a little time passes, and there's so much other things going on right now, especially with the special sessions this year, that you almost forget that these things happened, and then it dawns on you like, oh yeah, starting today,
Yeah.
you can carry on a weapon without any kind of paperwork whatsoever. So that is definitely, that's a reality now.
So I'm wondering if you can still get a permit if you want one. And the reason I ask is because there's things that you can do with the permit in Texas for guns that are not even related to guns at all. For instance, if you have a gun, you can walk into the Texas Capitol without going through the metal detectors, which is wild. But if you have a permit, and that's what I meant, if you have a permit, you could walk through the metal detector without going through metal detectors. If you have a permit, you could also use it to vote, ironically. And so, I'm curious if they're going to continue to allow people to get permits who want them. And there are training requirements. Previously, as I said, they always they keep these issues at the top, and they come back and chip away more and more each session. So last session it was it was open carry.
Mm-hmm.
And so, because just 4 years ago, you not only had to have a permit, you had to have training, you had to have more training. They reduced the number of hours of training that you had to have because it was over the course of 2 days. Previously, I think it was like 12 hours of training, and then they said no, it should only have to be one day. So we're going to reduce it to like 6 or 8 or whatever. And then also, you can't carry your gun open; you have to have it, concealed. And then now they were like, well, no, we shouldn't have to conceal it either. So now you don't need a permit, training, or to hide your gun anywhere you want it. And if you're a business, you have to have these gigantic signs outside your business saying that you can't, carry guns on the premises. So
Right. And I think, with all of this, we have to think about how all of these policies intersect, right? This now creates a reality where, say you have a business that, is saying that they want to require the people wear masks to come in. You're now going to have someone, in a circumstance where you have an employee who's making $10 an hour, $12 an hour, whatever it may be, who's having to tell someone who's not wearing a mask but is carrying a gun that they can't enter the premises, right? Like that is the real life circumstance that will happen. That is, being facilitated by Texas lawmakers.
absolutely. I mean, and that's sort of the dog whistle here, right? That, and I like to say on our normal podcast when they're doing these things, that these things are all connected. This isn't just, totally wholly separate things. This is about instilling fear in certain populations and controlling them in certain ways, limiting their freedom, even though they say it's done in the name of freedom. All these things actually make it harder to just have a normal civilized society. And so, but it's intentional. And so not only can they go into your restaurant without a mask and intimidate you with a gun, with this new voting bill, they can also do the same outside of the polling location. And
Right.
so this is all connected. This is all just about intimidating the same people that they don't want to show up to vote in the first place.
Right. And we'll touch on some of the Blue Lives Matter manifestations and legislation that came through in session, but to show just how kind of strategic even that kind of stance is that there were a lot of police chiefs, yeah, all around the state that came out against permitless carry because they said it was a hazard for public safety, but their voices fell on deaf ears when it came to
Right.
this.
Yeah, very conveniently so. And a lot of these issues, again, one of the through lines is that they affect people of color at a higher rate. And they're more punitive to people of color because of that. I mean, whether you're talking about abortion access, because who's more likely to not have the ability to travel out of state and things like that. And then you look at the permitless carry, and who's more likely to feel uncomfortable to openly carry a weapon and be subject to scrutiny by law enforcement. We know that that's people of color. We've seen it in certainly in the news and headlines of people who have tried to exercise that right.
Right.
And then the very next issue, which is on our list here, is about critical race theory. And so they want to erase any opportunity that you have to draw that through line from slavery, Jim Crow, separate but equal to the current day discrimination that we see against people of color. And you do that through education. And so they want to break down that ability for you to understand why we are here today and why certain people do feel targeted with some of this legislation.
Right. And as you're saying, right, this is all about controlling the narrative and ensuring that, not only necessary, but pretty straightforward conversations about our state's past are had, right? history is long, and the way history is discussed has long been shaped, not just in Texas, but across the country by Texas lawmakers, because it's such a huge market for textbooks, and so they can help set the standard and how things like slavery, race, the civil rights movement, and Texas history in of itself has been discussed in terms of the Texas's founding fathers owning slaves, and how that's just a fact, and those are things that have come to the forefront more after last year's George Floyd inspired like racial reckoning about our country's past. And that's something that people have been pushing for, just being able to have these discourses in our classrooms, and rather than embracing these things, or at least acknowledging that there is a problem that should be addressed in some capacity, Republicans have chose to instead try to bury not just their heads but our children's heads in the sand with this. And so I mean, these are things like, trying to water down discussions about the Ku Klux Klan, all right? Trying to ensure that things like lynching will be taught from all viewpoints. And so these are things that should, right? Like, I don't even know what the other viewpoint is, but, it's a situation where, these are things that shouldn't be controversial, that they were bad and are stains on our country and our state's history.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's, that is certainly what the goal is, to prevent that type of education, and therefore people kind of understanding how to maybe make some changes to sort of close the gaps that we see and the disparities we see between people of color and white people in this country, whether it's wealth, accumulation, or job opportunities, educational opportunities, housing. All these things are rooted together, and they know that. And so everything we can always say, and you hear it over and over, it starts with education. And so that's why they're starting with education. And so the irony is, you mentioned the forefathers of Texas being having slaves. We now, since the past year, have a new national holiday, Juneteenth, which is specifically acknowledging that it took an additional over 2 years for slaves in Texas to finally get the news that they were free. So
Right.
this isn't new. This has been happening for a very long time. This is happening since the beginning of our state's inception, that they try to limit the information that goes to certain people to keep them in their place, as it were. And
And just a quick note, I said they were slave owners. I guess the better way to say it is they were enslavers, right? Is that they were not owners, they were enslavers of human beings. So just to kind of
Oh,
quick
yeah,
edit
yeah,
on
that's a good
that.
point. I mean, yeah, we shouldn't acknowledge the fact that people were ever considered, property to be correct. That's a good, call out. And the fact is, when the woman who fought from Texas, who fought so hard to get Juneteenth acknowledged nationally, it's amazing, because she went on the Senate floor literally in the middle of this debate about voting rights and how it's attacking people of color's right to vote, and talked about how great it was that we were acknowledging Juneteenth, but that we still have to continue to fight, and it's so sad that we still have to continue to fight. And they acknowledged her. Republicans brought her, oh well, we're so glad you're here, this is such a great thing you're doing. And as soon as she left, they're passing these strict voting rules that limit access to the polls, and limit the access of teaching things that we just made a new holiday about. So this is all part of an orchestrated effort, like you said, to control the narrative. And when they say don't talk about race, it's because it makes them uncomfortable to talk about, because they know that it's having disparate effects. And if you talk about it, then that means you're going to eventually have to do something about it. And they don't want to do anything about it.
Right. And just like anything else, these are things that have long existed in Texas policy, and in this case, Texas classrooms. And the difference is that it's just so much more blatant, right? Because they didn't have to defend these stances before, and they're doing so openly, which is different, right? And we can get into later as we talk about the latest developments at the legislature during the second special session, about how they're still continuing these efforts to kind of entrench white supremacy in the classroom, right? This isn't the only piece of legislation that they have pushed on this front.
Right, true. And I usually will I have to shake my head at how consistent they are, and how good they are at tying all these issues together in a way that is digestible for their audience and keeps them on the same page. But I feel like the one place that I've seen some confusion and where their narrative kind of doesn't really work so well is on COVID, because it is their own people. Well, first of all, it was Trump. One of the very few good things Trump did was Operation Warp Speed and get the vaccine up and running as quickly as possible. But it's his people who don't want to get the vaccine. And so it's his people that are causing all these additional shutdowns and stuff because they won't do what they need to do. They don't want to wear masks. They don't want to get vaccine.
The ones
So
who are dying
and there
oftentimes,
and so
right?
the, yeah, and that's where it gets to, like, well, maybe the narrative, they're finally kind of made a misstep because their people are dying, and they're the ones who are most affected by this. And so you called out HB 1230, which affects, churches and houses of worship, and with regards to these mask mandates and things.
Right, right. And basically, this is a situation where last spring, the governor, had to pass an emergency order regarding not gathering in large places, and so that was, it didn't specify that churches were exempt from that. And so in a lot of places, they kept the churches closed because you shouldn't be gathering large amounts of people indoors during a pandemic. And so what this bill does is pass an exemption. It says explicitly states that churches and other places of worship cannot be ordered to close for any reason, and that includes for emergency orders. So this is specifically a response to the pandemic and saying that, no matter what, we cannot have these things closed, even if it represents, basically, even if the people entering and sitting in those pews every Sunday are putting themselves and their community at risk. And we as lawmakers and forget lawmakers, public health officials who are in their respective counties can't do what's best to keep their communities safe.
Yeah. I wonder if that means that Joel Osteen can't close his church when a hurricane evacuation comes.
I saw that he put up a video actually just before Hurricane Ida hit, specifically saying that our doors are open to everyone. So
Haha,
he was
yeah.
ahead on this time.
Yeah, he was. Yeah, he took a little hit on that last one, locking people out. And but yeah, so yeah, that's pretty interesting to note that, they're all in on this messaging, but it's them who are really the biggest victims for once, and it's not a good thing. Obviously, this is a bad thing because the virus doesn't care. The virus won't not jump to a liberal or somebody who is, taking more precautions. And then we even know that people who are doing everything right can still pass it along to others. They can still get it, and maybe it keeps them out of the hospital, which is obviously good and totally worth it because the vaccine is free. It's free. People are begging you to get it. Just go get it. Both of us are vaccinated. And you actually get a higher level of freedom when you get the vaccine. And so, there's
No,
nothing freedom or patriotic about sitting in the ICU for 3 weeks. Like, where's your freedom there?
this is an anti-horse dewormer podcast. That's for sure.
Yes. Yeah.
And we can, there's a number of other bills that came through, and we can kind of fire through these real
Yeah.
quick. Just kind of rattling some of them off. Let me know if you have a reaction to them. SB4 went into effect today. This was passed in response to the Dallas Mavericks decision to stop playing the national anthem at their games. Which I think that was meant as a gesture to respect the wishes of their players. Obviously the NBA has been very outspoken about the Black Lives Matter movement and being able to allow players to protest the national anthem.
Well, the ironic thing is, and the brilliant thing is that Mark Cuban even said, like, we did this quietly. We didn't make us think about it because
Right.
we wanted to see how long it would take people to notice. And it took many games.
It took a while. Yeah.
And then when they found out, they're like, oh my God, well, we better pass a bill. People aren't saying the Pledge of Allegiance or whatever. And it's so stupid.
Yeah. And again, it's, as we
Forced
saw
patriotism isn't real.
right. And also, like, why are we focusing on sports games? There's bigger things at play. There was also SB 968 that basically was passed by the governor or signed by the governor and pushed forward by him, prohibiting businesses from requiring customers to provide proof of vaccination. Um, we've seen that Texas TABC, Texas Alcohol,
Mm-hmm.
um, you know, uh,
TABC, yeah.
yeah, yeah. I'm forgetting the exact acronym, but that they've threatened apparently to take away the alcohol licenses of businesses in Austin that have been asking people to have vaccinations to come inside. So
Specifically and ironically, because tonight is my anniversary dinner, we booked it at one of this two restaurants that caused this bill, because we saw that they were requiring vaccine cards, and we're like, oh, well, we have our vaccine cards, let's book there. That's pretty cool. And so we did it, and then probably a week later after we did it, they said we're going to not allow that, and the governor did an executive order first, as you mentioned, targeting these two restaurants in Austin, and he didn't like it, so now it's whole statewide. Nobody in the whole state of Texas. And
where are you going?
Laundrette in East Austin is the name of the restaurant. Yeah.
Yep.
Very good. Yeah, highly recommend.
Went there for my fiance's birthday recently.
Nice.
So good. Yeah. There's also HB9. This was the felony charges for protesters. Again, this is made in response to the mass protests that were last summer following George Floyd's murder. And it's basically saying that it's a felony for demonstrators to knowingly block roadways when an emergency vehicle is present. And so the thing to keep in mind here is this isn't because there were people who were not allowing an ambulance through with its flashing sirens. It's a police car is considered an emergency vehicle. So it's basically just saying we could disperse you by flashing our sirens. And if you don't, then it's a felony. And so, I mean, that's a big deal. That's obviously a huge strike against the ability to mass gather and protest.
Yeah. I mean, that's literally their response to people saying, hey, we think there's some injustice going on with the criminal justice system and law enforcement. And their response is to just make it a felony, and so that just tells you where they are, and again fits right into this longer narrative that we've been discussing.
Right. And then there's HB 1925, which is criminalizing homeless camping. It makes it a fine up to $500, and that was passed in response to Austin's policy that was allowing public camping, which has since been repealed anyway by Austin, unfortunately. Mm-hmm. So not sure how big of an impact it has, but it just shows again that Texas, whenever it can, it will muddle in the affairs of its individual municipalities.
Yeah, in the cruelest way possible, always.
Right.
Yeah, the irony here is that if you did make it a felony, they would actually have to house these people. They would be housed in jail, but they would be housed. And in this case, like, no, we're just going to fine you. You're homeless. We're going to fine you $500. Like, where's a homeless person going to get $500 from? So that's they're very creative in their cruelty, but they are definitely consistent.
Yeah, I don't know where you're getting that money from. It's just it just is going to create a circumstance where someone is fined, they don't show up to their court hearing because they don't have the money for it, and then we allocate police funds to go track them down if we serve a warrant. And so that doesn't increase public safety. It also doesn't save the city money or allocate any kind of public funds well.
And it doesn't solve homelessness.
Right. So, and that's at the core of it.
Yeah.
And then the last one, which is also inspired by Austin, last August, Austin City Council voted to reduce its police budget by up to $100 million. Keep in mind that its police budget is still several $100 million. So there was no quote unquote defunding of the police. That hasn't stopped Republicans from using that narrative. But this was a bill that passed. It was part of a series of Back the Blue bills that basically seeks to punish cities for reducing their police budgets by deducting money from its sales tax, and it would ban the city from increasing property taxes or utility fees. So, trying to wherever it can to squeeze cities that are trying to reimagine public safety in a different way.
Yeah, I mean, in the city of Austin, policing budget is 40% of the entire city budget.
Right.
And so this is the first time Republicans have ever had an issue with a tax cut, essentially. But the idea was not to necessarily take it away from policing as much as it was to reallocate it towards other things that would reduce the need for heavy policing. And so actually, it's just giving police help in a way that instead of saying, here's another tool that's a baton instead of a gun, or this is a tool that may prevent you from having to use any kind of a force at all. Because and I've noticed this. I've had to dial 911 a couple of times in the past year, never for myself personally, fortunately. But I did notice immediately after this that the first thing they say is this a mental health issue, or do you need the police? And I'm so glad that they do that, because the two times I called were, this is a mental health issue. And one time I was just at the park across the street and throwing the frisbee with a friend, a neighbor friend, and there was a guy threatening people in the park with a knife. Now I know this guy wasn't doing it just necessarily to be violent, but I knew that there was something wrong. So I called 911, and I was definitely concerned. I had concern. I was like, are they going to send a cop here? Well, I tell a guy's got a knife. They're going to come ready armed to like just shoot this guy.
Right.
And so luckily when I called, they said, is this a mental health issue? I said, yes. I think this guy's having have some issues, and you need to send somebody to come talk to him. And they did that. And they were able to beforehand approach it in a different way, in a way that, didn't result in somebody dying, and that's the
Right.
goal,
And as you're saying, right, this isn't just cutting police funds. This is creating a circumstance where we're using our police most effective when you need so. If someone is having a mental health crisis, this empowers and provides funding for a mental health licensed professional to show up and serve that need. And that's a win-win for everyone. It's a win for
Yeah.
that person, so they're not, they receive the help they need. It's a win for the community, so that hopefully that person can be linked to resources. And frankly, it's a win for police, so that they don't have to show up to things that they're not equipped to handle, right?
Yeah. I mean, how much training can you do? Like, you want the police to be trained in protecting people and themselves, but they can't also be psychologists and like learn all these other tools and skills that are completely different professions. They
Right.
need to work together, and we need to be smart so that people work together the way you were saying.
And that's how
Uh,
you increase public safety.
there
Yeah.
you go. There you go. It's not, policing is a subset of public safety. It's not all of public safety, but some of these folks, and particularly these Republicans in Austin that are trying to change things, only view enforcement as public safety. And so that's just not true at all.
Right. And just from an individual perspective, I don't know how you kind of approached it. And it's not saying you wouldn't have called 911, but I imagine that situation you call, and there's probably a level of ease where you're like, okay, I'm not potentially giving this guy a death sentence if I call the
Yeah,
police and they show up and
absolutely.
they shoot him, right? That would weigh on you.
Yeah, well, absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. You have to think about that, and I do.
Yeah.
And so, okay, so the latest, right? What's going on now? We're still in a special session. The
Still
really
going on.
still happening, so the initial voter suppression bill, finally did pass the House. It did pass the Senate, and now it's on Governor Abbott's desk. You want to talk about some of the high level stuff that it does?
I don't know. We talked about this thing about how terrible it was and how terrible it was in theory for so long because Democrats had broken quorum. And as they had returned the last couple of weeks without any real incentive, at least hasn't been expressed openly, this allowed for Republicans to ram through SB1, which is the voting rights bill. For those who either aren't familiar, or just there's so many facets to this thing, you need a quick refresher. It establishes new ID requirements for voting by mail, which means it reduces access to it. It enhances protections for partisan poll watchers and sets new rules, meaning that it actually empowers them to intimidate people more. And it even, potentially allows people to levy possible criminal penalties for those who assist voters. It also makes it a state felony for local election officials who, proactively distribute applications for mail-in ballots, even if they are providing them to voters who automatically qualify to vote by mail. It bans drive-through voting and sets new limits on early voting hours to outlaw overnight voting. Republicans have come out and they've said that they were targeting initiatives carried out in Harris County that were incredibly successful in driving out voters and increasing voter participation. Which of course, county officials have said, those specifically were used most by voters of color. So It's pretty clear the through line there. And I think
Yep.
it's important to mention, just the two kind of sides of this in terms of how this was discussed by lawmakers and just how kind of really just disappointing and discouraging it is. State Senator Brian Hughes, who was the one who helped, push this through in the Senate. He said, quote, "We don't do 24-hour voting in Texas, but we have a lot of opportunities to vote. We don't do drive-through voting, but we make sure that folks who have disabilities have access to curbside voting." And so, not really sure how that answers the question in terms of if you were to ask him how, how we can best serve people and get them to turn out to polls.
Well,
It
that's, yeah,
feels
obviously that's not the goal, right?
right,
And then
right,
how do you determine who has disabilities and who doesn't? Like
right,
that was in the original bill. It was like people with disabilities have to prove that they're disabled. I mean, that's insane. So, first of all, you don't necessarily know just by looking somebody that they're disabled. And how, I mean, how like cruel and unusual is it that you make a disabled person demonstrate how they're disabled? I mean, it makes no sense, but they're not trying to actually make sense. They
right,
only just want
right,
to discourage you from participating.
right. There's no difference in my, even, for me, I'm an able-bodied person. There's no difference in my ability to vote, you know, if I walk into a place or if I drive through and I hand them my credentials. There's no difference there. And that's the point, right? Like this was all, and then keep in mind the provisions that they're fighting were specifically put in place because we're in the middle of a pandemic, right? And
Mhm.
so again, don't kind of fall for the smoke screens or the distractions that that they're saying in these kind of quotes. These are direct attacks on voting access, and there's no way around it.
And I think you bring up a good point that most of this was a tax levied specifically on policies that were changed in Harris County because there were very large numbers of people of color who were voting this way, and that's why they did it, because they didn't want people around the state to get savvy on these sort of innovative ideas and start implementing them. And so what I was thinking as I was talking to somebody about this was the big counties, because I don't think this actually takes place. Obviously, it's already September, so I don't think this actually takes place until January. It goes into effect until January. And so, if that is the case, we have an election in November, and I think every large county needs to implement 24-hour voting and curbside voting specifically for this November election. And that way, in January, when the law does go into effect, they literally, it's no longer theoretical. They've actually taken away things that people experience and had a positive experience with. And you can say, oh, remember how convenient it was when you drove through that one time, or
Right,
you had somebody just send you an application in the mail and there was your application and you filled it out. And well, you can't do that anymore. And so
right.
they're looking out ahead and they're saying, oh my God, that was so successful in Harris County, we got to stop it from anybody else using it. So I think we need to get our Dallas County and Travis County and Bear County folks together and say we got to show people what's actually being taken away from them.
Absolutely, absolutely. And again, I Republicans are the ones who are steering the ship. They're the ones who made this happen. They're the ones who are pushing this forward. But we do have to acknowledge the fact that the Democrats who showed back up in the Texas House, allowed them to do this because, and it just also, it only kind of drives home the point that, any kind of arguments that were made, which were made by those who showed back up, that we could show up and we could make this bill better, and several of the other bills that we'll talk about that have since passed. It's just not the case, right? This is a quote from State Representative Garnett Coleman. He's a Houston Democrat who's returned to the chamber, helped eventually push over the quorum. He's one of the last people to show up. And he said, quote, "This bill is not good enough for me to vote for. I think it still has major flaws that will create problems down the road. And all I can hope is that if these problems occur, that we come back here in 2 years and fix it. Because the worst thing we could ever do is prevent someone from exercising their constitutional right to vote." And I just feel like that quote, while on its face sounds nice, we have to live in the reality that we knew
Yeah,
this was going to
precisely.
happen. Of course, it's not good enough for you to vote for. Saying it has major flaws that will create problems down the road is just the biggest understatement I can think of.
Yeah, it's a solution in search of a problem that doesn't exist. So the flaw is the bill itself. There's no need for any of that to take place. the Republican Secretary of State said our elections went off without a hitch, and everything was fine, and there was no extensive voter fraud or anything like that going on. And we knew that. But so, yeah, so absolutely no, they're not going to come back in 2 years and fix it unless we get a Democratic majority, and then maybe we come back 2 years and fix it. But that's what they're trying to prevent by putting this in place, is a
Right.
Democratic majority. So I don't, it's unfortunate that Garnett Coleman who's been there for decades, he knows this,
Right.
that he would do that, or even go back. But thus here we are. And as they tried to get Democrats to come back, one of the main hostages that they took was literally all of their own staff. When the governor vetoed Article 10 funding, which is just a part of the budget that funds legislative staff, the Legislative Budget Board, and a few other agencies. We're talking thousands, over 2,000 Texas state employees that have absolutely nothing to do with any of the legislation that's going through the system, basically had their paychecks pulled and held for ransom until Democrats came back. And even as Democrats came back, as you mentioned, and they passed this bill, the bill is already passed. The governor signed this bill. They still have not refunded that Article 10 funding. And why? Because Dan Patrick, the lieutenant governor, who's essentially the president of the Senate, said, "Oh yeah, no, we got that voting bill passed, but we also want to do critical race theory, and we want to do this trans sports bill." Because he's just got to up the ante on the cruelty aspect of this. And so he's not relenting even after that bill is passed. So Democrats should have known better. There's absolutely no question that this was going to happen, as you mentioned, and it did happen, and they passed that bill, and here they are demanding even more. They're not even happy that they got the election bill passed. They want to shove even more of this sort of right wing garbage through, and that's what they intend to do. So the latest is that Harold Dutton, who is actually the chair of the education committee, he would have seen these bills come through his committee, critical race theory and the trans sports bill. Well, apparently they did meet last week, and he chose not to hear those bills. And he said some quote, almost verbatim, but to the effect of saying, "We're going to see if Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick is wearing his big boy pants." In other words, is he really going to call this bluff? Is he really going to prevent this Article 10 funding from passing if he doesn't get this critical race bill and this trans sports bill passed? So we'll see. That's where we are right now. There's only a few days left of the session. The session will end officially on, I believe, the 6th of September, so next week. And I think they need 3 days to lay a bill out after committee. So the window is closing fast. And so unless they really get to work over the weekend, I don't see how they will get Article 10 funding passed in this special session.
Right. And just to note, Dutton has sat on critical race theory. I hate using that term, but that's the term for it. On those education bills, he sat on that so far, but he did just recently allow. He sat on the trans sports bill, but he has since allowed the education bill to pass through to the House floor. And so it's gone to the House floor. It's already passed the Senate. And so hopefully there could be enough fight to delay that. But it looks like that it would be, which would, multiple of these bills from an educational realm have already been passed, but it looks like there could be another coming through.
Yeah. Also, I mean, yeah, to your point. Yeah, they already passed the critical race theory bill. They just wanted a worse one. They that one wasn't bad enough. They just passed it like within a couple months ago, and they're like, yeah, we could take another crack at
it. We've got time here. Yeah,
because it's all about punishing people who left. Democrats, yes, but almost, I think there's only 2 members of color that are not Democrats. And so these are people of, like, basically every person of color is ones who actually left the state to say, hey, this really hurts our constituents. And the way Republicans responded was by doing even more of the same. And so that's just where we're at. But
and when you think about the mask ban for schools, or when you think about this, these education bills, and it just further goes with the idea that we're going to politicize things for teachers, right? Teachers already critically underpaid in Texas, criminally underpaid, excuse me. Have a hard enough job as it is. They're having to now work within a pandemic, back to in person, and now this is happening. And so, again, the fact that they're going back to the well on this again is not surprising, but you wonder how much more you can kind of try to really openly try to entrench white supremacy in the classroom, but they're doing more.
Yeah.
We also just recently, the Texas Senate voted to approve HB 9, which will allocate nearly $2 more billion in funds for border security over the next 2 years. The state already passed $1 billion for this earlier this year. And so, looks like Greg Abbott is now $3 billion again of state funds that are going towards border security, which, again, is just trying to focus as much attention on that as possible as his reelection bid.
I mean, you might as well just burn it.
Right.
Fire, because that's about how successful it's going to be. I don't know if you've seen some of these pictures of the Trump border wall is already deteriorating. There's these pictures of some of the floods that have come up and totally destroyed entire sections of the fence. They don't even exist anymore. I mean, you could walk straight through them. So it's just such a waste.
And it's not as if immigration, a wall even does that anyway, even accomplishes that goal if you were trying to do that.
I saw a really funny meme. Speaking of cultural impacts here, the crate challenge that's been going on online.
Yeah, right? The milk crate challenge. Yeah.
So somebody did a crate challenge where the crate went up, and it was a border wall, and it was just like the crates just went up to the top, and it was like you could just walk over to the other side. That's like, it is about that easy. That's right. I mean, if you had enough crates, you could do the crate challenge right over Greg Abbott's wall, and here you are in the United States. So so it's a silly concept. I mean, you're really like calling into, I guess, like, to me, it's kind of offending people's intelligence to say that you walk 1,000 miles and you get to a barrier that's 10 feet tall and you say, oh, well, I guess better turn around. Like, what do they think is going to happen? So anyways, it's just so silly. But yeah, so we're getting a little long in the tooth here, I guess. But I think it is good to point out the last bit here that you have on redistricting, because as soon as this session is over, they're going to immediately call another one back to deal with redistricting, which again fills the same narrative where they're going to try to reduce the power of and accountability of the people once more. Specifically, they're going to be targeting people of color, as federal courts have decided multiple times that the lines the legislature have drawn discriminate actively against people of color. And so we're going to see that happen. You point out that Senators Roland Gutierrez of San Antonio and Sarah Eckhart, who is probably both of our state senators, filed a motion in federal court to essentially say that these maps can't be drawn during a special session. I'm skeptical of that simply because I remember back in 2003, it's exactly what they did. But I'm glad that people are thinking outside of the box here and trying different things, because we have to try.
Yeah, right. And one thing to note is that they're not challenging the redrawing of congressional lines. So they're specifically talking about just state lines here. Mm-hmm. So we'll have to see what comes of that. But yeah, I think it more just underscores that, redistricting is just around the corner here. It just kind of keeps rolling here in Texas.
Yeah. And so, of course, that's based on the census and all the people moving to Texas. But there's one particular person who's moved to Texas who's made a lot of headlines and continues to grow his own presence here. That would be one Elon Musk.
What a transition. Look at that transition, Joe. Yeah. Well, that's our little pop culture moment of the day. There was a headline recently in Texas Monthly saying how Elon Musk wants to sell Texans electricity, and that Tesla has filed to become a Texas power retailer. So people think that could shake up, the state's energy market. Obviously, we all remember what happened to the grid not too long ago in Texas, something that still has not been addressed. And so, yeah, what do you think about Elon powering your lights every night?
Well, I've actually followed his career for a very long time and watched him as he, built his companies. And one of the things that was very interesting was when he had Tesla, he got Tesla to buy another one of his companies, which was Solar Cities. And so I don't. This is the first I'm hearing about this. This is interesting. My guess is that he, it's residential solar. I don't know, but my guess would be that he's just trying to roll out his not only the solar panel business, but then his Tesla battery packs. And of course, the combination of having the solar panels and the battery packs is that you produce your energy during the daytime, and then in the evening and night, you're running everything off those batteries. I mean, I would think that anybody who experienced what we all went through in February in Texas is probably looking for alternatives and other ways to make sure that, hey, if Greg Abbott and these guys can't keep the lights on, then maybe Elon Musk can. Who
Right.
knows?
Right. And, he is a resident of, at least he has a residence here in Austin. He's building a plant just outside of Austin. Also, there's, as a lot of people know, he has the SpaceX out in Boca Chica Beach in the Rio Grande Valley. And so this just kind of further cements him trying to, we'll see about the services of itself, but Elon Musk obviously is very much also a very personality driven
Yeah.
kind of phenomenon. And so, it certainly furthers his footprint in Texas. And I think there's definitely some kind of meme out there of, someone knocking at the door and people think like, oh, it's the, it's like the guy here to save us. It's the celebrity. Is it McConaughey? No, it's Elon Musk instead.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
not quite what we want.
Yeah. Yeah. Man, but who knows? It is interesting to that Elon, you wouldn't think that he'd be a natural, ally or somebody that Republicans would like, because he's like pushing electric cars. He's really big on climate change, but there's just there are some things in there, and I guess partially it's just the business aspect because he's such a business mind type of guy. But yeah, this has been interesting to kind of see how that plays, and politically, but yeah, anyway, so yeah, it's Elon Musk knocking on the door.
Yeah, as
So,
long as you don't hear Elon for governor on the
oh
Democratic
yeah,
tickets too, and that's all that matters to
yeah,
me.
exactly. No, I think he wants to be the mayor of Mars. I think more governor of Mars before Austin. So we're probably more likely to see that.
Right, right, right. Joe, yeah, I mean, this is another good one, man.
Yeah, yeah. There's a lot. There's a lot to talk about. There's probably about 600 other bills we didn't mention that are probably more local based and have less of a statewide impact on people's lives. But a lot of this stuff goes on, and it's really important that people, understand what these guys are doing and see why they care so much about taking away your access to vote and the likelihood and the ease of which you should be able to do that. At the end of the day, what you're doing is holding them accountable, and anybody who's trying to take away your tools to hold them accountable, you got to start asking questions of why. And so we're hope that, listening to this podcast, you understand some of the reasons why, and the things that they're doing, because these are unpopular things. Polls have been done in Texas. A lot of these things, from guns to abortion, actually, even in Texas, these are unpopular measures because they have gone so far. And so, and the only way to push back against the majority is to reduce the number of people who vote and make sure it's just your people. And so that's what they're concentrating on doing. So we appreciate everybody trying to stay informed, and don't feel like hopeless, because the hope is there that when we are informed, and then we could figure out what actions to take to keep holding these people accountable. So we want to make sure everybody's registered to vote and gets out there, but make sure your folks know what's at stake here. It's really everything. It's the future. And so we appreciate you joining us and following all of our good work and David's good writing and things that he covers on texassignal.com. And so, follow us, join the conversation at Texas Signal on all of our social channels. We're on TikTok, we're on Instagram, we're on Facebook. And we got a new website, so check that out. And while you're there, look at the top right corner and click that Patreon button and become a supporter. It basically, your monthly contribution helps to keep this type of progressive journalism in Texas, which is desperately needed, more so today now than it was yesterday. And so that's why we're here to talk about everything that just got rolled out across the state. So David, you have any final words?
Yeah, just appreciate everyone listening. I know that some of that was quite a mouthful, but you know, the good men of and women of the Texas Capitol continue to give us plenty of fodder. So I know we'll be back soon to talk about more. But thanks as always for sticking with us, guys.
Yeah, thanks, y'all. Until next time. Later.